Welcome, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to this program that is brought to you by the North Shore Programming Consortium, which consists of 6 local libraries: Bayville, Gold Coast, Glen Cove, Locust Valley, Oyster Bay, and Seacliff. We've come together to bring our patrons more of a variety in adult programming in a more cost-effective way. We hope you enjoy this program, all the programs now accessible through the consortium. Our next program is next Tuesday, December 10th at 7 p.m. The topic is Unsung Heroes, Women of World War II. Please go to your library's webpage to register. Today's program is hosted by the Oyster Bay East Norwich Library. Out of respect to our presenter and other participants, we kindly ask that you remain muted during the program. If there's a Q&A, and there will be, you can unmute at that time if you want to participate. Without further ado, here is our lovely programmer, Leslie Goddard, with a fantastic program on mid-century Christmas traditions. Enjoy, everybody.
Hey, thanks. And you can probably see I've got my tinsel Christmas tree up with my shiny bright ornaments. I don't know if you can see, but I've got my winking Santa mug ready to go. I'm not really a collector, but I do like to have a couple of things to get going. I want to start this tonight with a bit of a quiz question for you. Actually, it is a quiz question for you. So let me pull up my slides here. You can you can put your answer in chat, or you can just answer it for yourself. To set it up for you, the longest running Christmas TV special in the United States is Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. It has been shown every year since 1964. Quiz question is, and here we go, what is the second longest running Christmas TV special in the US? Put your answer in chat. You can see. You can guess. There's no grades. You can really feel free to guess. Or you can just guess for yourself. Okay. The answer is, you ready? Oop, oop, oop. Charlie Brown Christmas. Maybe you've seen it a few, dozen times. It debuted on December 9th of 1965. It has been shown annually ever since, and it's still a hugely relevant, popular, it's got that great Vince Guaraldi jazz soundtrack and those lovable characters. But there is one thing that baffles kids who watch this TV special today. It's when Charlie Brown is directing the Christmas pageant and someone suggests that what they really need is a Christmas tree. And then we get this exchange between Charlie Brown and Lucy.
We need a Christmas tree.
Hey, perhaps a tree. A great, big, shiny aluminum Christmas tree.
Did you hear that? A great, big, shiny aluminum Christmas tree is what Lucy suggests they need to get. Kids today are a bit baffled when you tell them that, yes, for a short period of time in the 1950s and 60s, families all over the country put up Christmas trees made out of aluminum. Well, once in a while you'll see them, but really this is an anachronism today for the majority of American households, even though we still watch that TV special all the time. And I would say this is just one example of a whole slew of Christmas traditions that were really common, especially in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but are pretty rare today. In the post-war period, so roughly 1945 to roughly 1970, Christmas looked pretty different from how it looked at any other time in American history. This is the one era, and this is an idea that the historian Sarah Archer puts forward. It's the one era where Christmas took a pretty sharp detour away from the past and looked towards the future. Traditionally, and really today too, Christmas is steeped in old-fashioned symbolism, candles on the Christmas tree, and riding in a one-horse open sleigh, and handmade wooden toys. Christmas tends to be a big exercise in nostalgia, and it's been that way for most of American history, except at Mid-century, when Christmas was all shiny and bright, and you can actually match your Christmas tree to your hair color if you're lucky enough to have silver hair, right? And the decorations are all shiny and bright, and you have a lot of new materials, not just a lot of aluminum, which wasn't really new, but was more popular, but you also had plastic and in some ways it makes sense. This was an era of new materials, plastics and new processed foods and high-tech appliances. So maybe it's not that surprising that Christmas kind of became high-tech. Typically, when new materials hit the market, if they're suitable, they'll get incorporated into Christmas. But it was kind of unusual because this was such a future-looking, high-tech version of Christmas. You've got space travel incorporated into Christmas and the love of convenience foods. You see a lot of gelatin salads. This is a coleslaw, Frosty Slaw Man. It's essentially coleslaw made with gelatin and molded in bowls so you can make a snowman, I guess. You've got this great new holiday idea of serving hot Dr. Pepper. Heat Dr. Pepper in a saucepan and then put a thin lemon slice on top. The thin lemon slice is critical from people who love this, apparently. Americans in this era are all exhilarated by these new high-tech materials, and it gets wrapped up into how we celebrate Christmas. Sarah Archer was actually the one who said, there are two great eras for Christmas in the United States. One is the Victorian era with all of its, horse-drawn sleighs and candles. And the other is the post-war era when we made Christmas all modern and shiny and all about the future. And for people who grew up at mid-century, it's kind of fascinating to look back and see just how distinctive this futuristic Christmas of mid-century really was. So I want to take us through some of the most popular trends of this era and talk about how they reflected and shaped this sort of distinctive era. So let's start with those aluminum trees. Of all the trends I'm talking about, these probably had the shortest lifespan, from roughly 1955 until roughly mid-1960s, roughly 1965. If you never had them, they typically consisted of a wooden stand with holes drilled into it at an angle, and then these rods with fluffy silver kind of looking like needles on a tree, and you would stick the rods into that central pole and fluff them out. Now, it kind of makes sense in the post-war era. Aluminum had been very big during the war. Aluminum companies made a lot of aluminum during the war because it was perfect. It was light. It was very strong. It's great for building things like, airplanes. Well, after the war, aluminum companies still wanted to sell a lot of aluminum. So they developed these aluminum Christmas trees. Now, they did have some decorating challenges. If anyone had one, it is not safe to use electric lights on them. The branches can become charged with electricity if there's a faulty light on your Christmas tree lights. So you don't use traditional Christmas tree lights. Instead, you use, ding, 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 a rotating color wheel. This is sort of a rotating light with multicolored gels and a light bulb behind it. So as the wheel moved, it would cast different colors onto the branches. Aluminum trees were fun and new and fairly inexpensive. You could get a nice evergreen tree for as little as $7. In today's money, that's about $60. So these were not wildly expensive for the time, but they did kind of capture the essence of a mid-century Christmas. They were lightweight, they were cheerful, they were futuristic, they were fun. That's kind of the essence of what Christmas felt like in this era. And they are also not nearly as common today. We still use artificial trees for sure. There was a survey done by the American Christmas Tree Association 2 years ago. They found that of the 94 million US households that put up a Christmas tree, 85% of those households used an artificial tree. But almost all of those trees were realistic green Christmas trees. And of course, there were many other technologies, often either invented for World War II or popularized by the war, that became part of Christmas traditions, not just decorating, but presents. Do you remember the Slinky toy? The Slinky, if you don't know the story, it's a great story. It was invented by accident in 1943. A mechanical engineer was trying to develop springs that would keep sensitive ship equipment stable during a storm at sea. He accidentally knocked some of the sample springs off a shelf, and he was amazed when the springs didn't just fall down, they sort of walked end over end. So he and his wife borrowed $500, manufactured the first Slinkies as toys. The problem with Slinky initially is that people didn't know how you were supposed to play with them. It was only when Gimbel's department store, the one in Philadelphia, let them do demonstrations for Christmas in 1945 that suddenly people thought, oh, now I get it. And they sold something like 400 of them within minutes. What took the Slinky to huge popularity nationwide was the television commercial, because the television commercial, in addition to having a very memorable song, it showed you how to use them. Let's see if I can get this one to play. You might remember this song yourself.
Who walks the stair without a care and shoots so high in the sky, bounce up and down just like a clown. Everyone knows it's Slinky, the best present yet to give or get, but costs a little to buy. The hit of the day when you're ready to play. Everyone knows it's Slinky, it's Slinky, it's Slinky. For fun it's the best of the toys. It's Slinky, the favorite of girls and boys.
By the way, most household steps are too tall for that kind of a descent. I think those are specially made stairs.
It's Slinky, for fun it's the best of the toys. It's Slinky, the favorite of girls and boys. Everyone wants a Slinky, you ought to get a Slinky.
It's a perfect example of a toy directly coming out of the war effort. For the next one I want to show you another toy. This is a visual quiz question, so take a look at the image. Anyone know what 40s, 50s toy is this? If your screen is really good or really big, you might even be able to read it. Put your answer in chat. There you go. There you go. If you don't know immediately, this particular little tub of goo is Silly Putty. Silly Putty also came out of the war when Japan invaded some Asian nations in the years leading up to and including World War II. It posed a real threat to America's natural rubber supply. So US chemists started looking for some synthetic rubber. And one chemist mixed together silicone oil and boric acid. Turns out this is a terrible substitute for natural rubber, doesn't have any good use, but it's really fun to play with. You know, if you pull it apart slowly, it'll stretch, but if you snap it on the edge of a table, it'll break in pieces. The New Yorker ran an article about Silly Putty in 1950, and within 3 days, more than 250,000 Silly Putties were actually sold. So you've got these new technologies, but it's not just things coming out of new technologies from the war. There was this real sense of excitement and novelty about all kinds of Christmas gifts. You could get products, all kinds of different products in fashion colors, like you see in this Smith Corona typewriter. You can get it in alpine blue or desert sand or seafoam green. You can get everything. You can get typewriters and telephones and card tables in all these fantastic colors. It's fun and it's vivid and it's really exciting, right? It's colorful. In other words, Christmas at mid-century was not only feeling new, it had this kind of zingy, thrilling excitement about it. And when you think about it, that kind of taps into the broader cultural currents of the post-war era, which was unquestionably very optimistic, very upbeat, and Americans had good reason to be upbeat. America's post-war economy was doing great. Industrial production was hitting an all-time high. A lot of Americans could afford to decorate and entertain and give gifts on a much larger scale than had been possible for a lot of American families before the war. And when you look at holiday decorating in particular in this era, it's kind of saturated with this optimism. There's this kind of whimsiness and joyfulness to it. Here's a really good example. Remember gelatin salads at mid-century, like that Frosty Slaw Man? Molded gelatin was really nothing new. That goes back to 1700s. But at mid-century, you've got electric refrigerators. Those, which really boomed in the mid-century era, made it incredibly easy to make colorful and kind of sparkling Jell-O treats. Incredibly easy. And they're colorful and they feel kind of futuristic. They're perfect for this era. Or anyone remember these little elf decorations? If you never had them, these were mass produced in Japan starting in the early 50s. Japan was still in post-war reconstruction. These were called knee-hugger elves because they originally came with these long legs that were bent under the knees. Their bodies were fabric, and then they had hard plastic faces. They were made by a company called Yuletide, and they were a huge part of America's efforts to get the Japanese economy going. You could get them sometimes attached to boxes of candy or bottles of dishwashing detergent. They were all part of this cute kitsch aesthetic that was really, really popular at mid-century. If these look a little familiar, these were the elves that inspired the 2005 book Elf on the Shelf, which inspired that particular trend, goes on to today. Or going back to those winking Santa mugs, these were made by a company called Holt Howard. Holt Howard was actually started by 3 college friends. They met at the University of Massachusetts. In 1949, they teamed up to create this line of unique, whimsical ceramics. They always had these really animated faces and these kind of atomic looks to them. Winking Santa mugs were probably the most popular Holt Howard. By the way, these are also mass made today. Mine is original. They are easy to find in replicas today, but the original Holt Howard ones are very collectible. As are other Holt Howard items. This is their Merry Whiskers beverage set. Also incorporates that Santa hat made into the handle. There were ermine angels with these fabulous spaghetti art trim and kind of sponge gold decorations. Or my favorite, this is an ashtray, Jetstream ashtray. Santa is riding on an airplane that is apparently shaped like a reindeer. I don't know why, but why not? All of these ceramics have this kind of whimsical, kind of cartoon-like joyfulness to them that really reflects that optimism at mid-century. All right, what about Christmas trees? Well, we know from aluminum Christmas trees, it was all about being bright and shiny, right? And nothing was brighter or shinier than, do you know where I'm getting at? Shiny, bright ornaments. Okay, I have to tell you, I love photographs of people posing with their Christmas trees. And this woman is amazing because not only does she have an aluminum tree, but she's covered it with shiny, bright ornaments. Just to give you the brief history, glass ornaments were imported from Europe starting in the mid to late 1800s, mostly from Germany, but also Poland, Czechoslovakia, and even Japan. But in the late 1930s, started to become clear that, these are probably not going to be available for importation if the US enters the war. So in the late 30s, a German immigrant named Max Eckhart teamed up with Woolworth's department stores. And they approached Corning Glassworks to see, could they make glass ornaments? And the answer is yes. Corning adapted a machine that had been designed to make glass light bulbs and started making glass ornaments. Woolworths sold them under the brand name Shiny Bright, and there's a reason for that name. He painted the inside of the ornament with silver or pastel tinted nitrates. So the outside was glass, which really, really shone. Perfect for mid-century when America was really ready for bright colors and shiny styles. Shiny Bright ornaments originally sold for 2 cents to 10 cents a piece. At one point, they were so popular, Corning was making about 30,000 Shiny Brights a day. Originally, they were just round, but then Corning kept coming up with more and more complex shapes. You know, they had atomic shapes and bells and teardrops, and some of them had little reflectors stamped into them to make your Christmas lights sparkle even more. The popularity of Shiny Brights did not decline until the 1970s, which is when plastic shiny ornaments became available, which of course had the advantage of not shattering if you accidentally dropped one. The glass ornaments, Shiny Bright ornaments, could really make your tree shine. But if you want to bring your tree to life, you gotta have some kind of light on it. Now, interestingly, electric Christmas tree lights were invented not long after the light bulb, but it wasn't until NOMA and really in the 1920s that electric Christmas lights became widespread. And it kind of makes sense. There were areas of rural America that were not even electrified until the 1920s. By the late 20s, about 85% of American homes had electricity. But what NOMA did, and NOMA, by the way, was a consolidation of 15 smaller companies. They called it the National Outfit Manufacturers Association. They were the biggest makers of Christmas tree lights that were affordable. They were cheap, so they were accessible to everyone. And NOMA also pioneered lights, which solved one of the major problems with early string lights, which was if one went out, the whole strand went out. They developed a system, and you see it here on this box, where each lamp burns independently. By the late 60s, all Christmas light manufacturers had adopted that selling point, thanks to, to our great relief, because that was a pain. NOMA was really inventive. In 1946, they introduced to the US a new innovation. Do you remember? Bubble lights? The bubble light was actually an idea imported from the UK to the US. These were candle-shaped bulbs that were filled with liquid methylene chloride. And that methylene chloride could be heated to a low boiling point with just the heat from a tiny little Christmas tree light bulb. So when that happened, the liquid would visibly bubble inside the lamp, and they're just mesmerizing. They were introduced in the US in 1946. By 1950, NOMA had sold more than 150 million bubble lights. All right, so you've got Shiny Brights and you've got electric Christmas tree lights. What if you want even more sparkle, but you don't want an aluminum tree? Well, you could always cover your tree in tinsel icicles. Tinsel icicles actually have a really, they date back really far. If you go back to Renaissance Germany, icicles were made by hammering out real silver into very, very thin sheets and then individually hand-cutting thin strips, which could be hung up. As you might expect, these were incredibly expensive and they tarnished really, really easily. Manufacturers at the turn of the 20th century were experimenting with different materials that would be cheaper, including aluminum, but that turns out it was a fire hazard. They tried copper, but they finally settled on lead. Now, lead seemed perfect It was really inexpensive, it didn't tarnish, and it wasn't flammable. If you can read the box on the far right here, I actually have the box sitting next to me, it says fireproof decorations. Actually, the one in the middle says fireproof as well. Well, what could be more perfect than this? It was lead in the icicles that really made them popular. And of course, led to hundreds of parents saying, put on one strand at a time, right? Until your mom wasn't looking, and then you could just throw a glob on. And of course, what is the answer to the question, how much tinsel is too much? The answer is there is no such thing as too much tinsel on your Christmas tree, right? So the question is, why don't we see tinsel icicles very much anymore? Well, mostly it's because we know today that lead is poisonous. It was in the 70s that the US government started regulating lead limits. By 1972, lead tinsel was off the shelves. It's still made, but it's made with mylar today, which is a kind of a PVC plastic. It's safer, but it doesn't hang. It doesn't have the weight that earlier icicles had, and it's also very, very staticky. But let's take a step back. Let's take an even broader picture. Christmas in the post-war era was really shiny and exciting. But in a much bigger sense, Americans in the post-war era were living in a really exciting new world. It really was an entire world filled with new materials, new technologies. It was a new kind of world, including things like new housing developments, like, oh, I don't know, Levittown. Americans were moving to the suburbs in unprecedented numbers. It was in 1947 that William Levitt built the first of these many Levitt towns. You might know the story, right? He bought about 4,000 acres of farmland on Long Island. But this is actually only the most visible part of a much broader explosion of new home building and movement into the suburbs. Home ownership in mid-century just skyrocketed. There were a lot of these Levittown-like housing developments that involved oftentimes very identical houses put up very economically, very quickly. And it made sense because you've got the GI Bill, which is making qualified veterans, usually meaning white middle-class veterans, able to buy houses for less than it would cost to rent. If you look at the United States, in 1940, 43% of Americans owned their homes. By 1960, 62% of Americans owned their home. Now, this is a big jump in this same time period. And you see that incorporated into Christmas as well. There's a really recent study done of typical Christmas songs that are played on American radio stations these days. They were studying when these songs were originally written. And what did it show? It showed very clearly that the majority of our favorite Christmas songs today date to the post-war era. If you can't read this particular graph, the decades that are showing the majority of the songs are the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, especially the 1940s. But it's not that surprising because you've got the longing for home during World War II, and then you've got the emphasis on home life and family life in the post-war years in the 50s and the 60s. If you pay attention to Christmas songs from this era, they often specifically mention issues of the nuclear family, small town life, love of home. Just to give you a couple of examples, you have lyrics like in the song, "It's Beginning to Look Like a Lot Like Christmas," "The prettiest sight to see is the holly that will be on your own front door." That was written in 1951. It's all about domesticity and holiday cheer. "Silver Bells," that was 1950. Has a lot to do with consumerism and Christmas shopping. The shoppers rush home with their treasures. Home for the Holidays from 1954. Oh, there's no place like home for the holidays, no matter how far away you roam. And here's my favorite trivia on this particular topic. Do you know the song, Do You Hear What I Hear? This was written in October of 1962. Do you remember what was happening in the US in October of 1962? It was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Do You Hear What I Hear was written as a plea for peace. It includes the line, pray for peace, people everywhere. It's a direct reference to it. The reality is, Americans had really good reason to focus on domesticity in the post-war era. Great Britain had been ravaged by the war, so the two new superpowers, you've got the United States and you've got the Soviet Union, both very large, both very powerful, and they're both ideologically opposed. Communism, by its nature, right? It's a unique threat to the United States. It is by definition anti-capitalist. What's one good way to sort of undercut the whole communist idea that happiness comes from shared resources? Well, one good way is to promote the idea of a strong family with parents who provide a secure, warm, cozy household, just like you see in this Christmas image. In fact, you might remember in 1959, there was a very famous debate between Vice President Richard Nixon and the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Nixon was explaining to Khrushchev why the capitalist way of life was superior to communism. Well, if you're trying to prove that capitalism is better, one great way to do that is, look, point out all the advantages of a comfortable, well-stocked home. This is known as the kitchen sink debate because it was taking place in a model American home kitchen. You can probably see the appliances off on the right. Faced with the threat of a global conflict being waged across the Iron Curtain, domestic coziness isn't just comforting, it's pretty patriotic. And you see Christmas gift-giving ads in this era encouraging buying goods that are not just new, but will also contribute to domestic happiness. People with more buying power wanted new refrigerators and washing machines. And of course, this is a bonanza for the major makers of home appliances like Kenmore and Procter and General Electric. I have never seen any woman so excited to have convinced her husband to give her a new toaster for Christmas. In other words, you've got this brief period of time when post-war prosperity is coupling up with worry about possible conflict with the Soviet Union. It's a perfect scenario for middle-class homeowners to sort of double down on domesticity and the joys that consumerism can bring to household happinessism. I also think the explosion of home ownership and the growth of the suburbs in the Cold War era helps explain a lot of the new interest in outdoor Christmas decorating, because a lot more people now had homes to decorate the outside of. In 1953, 25% of all Christmas tree lights sold were to be used outdoors. GE even sponsored home lighting contests, and they would come up with guides of how to host your own light competition in your neighborhood, which is a good way to sell more GE Christmas tree lights. And in fact, the 1950s and 60s were sort of the heyday of corporate how-to booklet. Remember those little idea booklets and pamphlet cookbooks you could get, those glossy little pamphlet books? Things like, this is from Popular Mechanics, a Christmas handbook. These would come with detailed instructions how to make your own gift wrappings or toys or tree ornaments or decorations yourself. I think Cold War fears in this era also help explain why mid-century is the only era where Santa does not travel around in a sleigh pulled by reindeer. He's getting around on a spaceship. Well, when he's not getting around on a Norelco RZR, right? It's not surprising because a lot of American hopes in the post-war era were all about space, right? And Santa's a modern guy, right? I mean, he's not eating cookies anymore. He's smoking Lucky Strike cigarettes, right? So of course he's not riding in a sleigh. He's riding around in a spaceship. And when you think about it, there's a lot of outer space in traditional Christmas legends. You know, Santa flies up in the sky. What is it that the wise men follow? They follow a star. It makes a certain kind of sense to wrap up Christmas in this post-war space imagery. And speaking of the Cold War, if you're interested, did this happen in the USSR? Well, by golly, it did. Santa's Soviet counterpart was this white-bearded grandfather Frost. He also went in space. In the 60s, there was a lot of Soviet imagery showing grandfather Frost, you know, traveling around in a rocket, checking out Soviet satellites and things like that. This was also the era when NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, it's when they started tracking Santa on Christmas Eve. Speaking of which, I have a quiz question for you. You ready? Again, put your answer in chat, or you could just answer for yourself. Here we go. When did NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, initially it was CONAD, when did they start tracking Santa on Christmas Eve? Was it A, 1955, B, 1961, or C, 1967? What do you think? How early do you think they started doing that? All good guesses. The correct answer is, ding, 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 1955A. And again, it's a really interesting story. In 1955, Sears Roebuck and Company, remember them, bought a newspaper ad for their Santa hotline, but the phone number was accidentally misprinted. Instead of ringing Santa, it rang the Continental Air Defense Command, CONAD. And the guy who answered the phone, Harry Shoup, thought, what in the world is going on? But then someone at CONAD thought, this might be an opportunity. Maybe we can use this to help give the military a more warm and fuzzy feeling and less fearfulness. So they announced that CONAD would continue to monitor and track Santa and his sleigh against possible attack from those who do not believe in Christmas. And they have been doing that every year ever since. Although now it's all done online. You can go on the website in December. Most of December, it's just games. But if you go on there on Christmas Eve, you'll see images like this showing where Santa's, the time that I took this particular screenshot, I think this was last year, he was heading for Tunisia. He had already delivered 3.9 billion Christmas gifts at this particular moment. You also see Santa venturing into science fiction and comic books and in movies and TV. There had been science fiction prior to this era, but after World War II, these kind of images really took off. These are some aliens checking out Santa Claus decorating a tree with his 4 arms. You've also got a lot of rocket and robot kinds of toys and space guns. Even the major American makers of Christmas cards like Hallmark and smaller companies, they got into the space race. This is the front image of a Christmas card from this era. It shows Santa traveling by his rocket-powered spaceship. I mentioned earlier how some toys were incorporating new materials coming out of the war. But in a broader sense, American toys in this era really reflected America's pride in its technology and toys and games that would encourage a love of science and learning in kids. I believe these kids are playing with remember the game Mousetrap? I think that was from '64, if I got that right. You want to know the #1 toy for boys at mid-century? You might be able to guess. Toy trains. you've got not just the fact that railroads were ubiquitous in everyday life in this era, it was also this kind of fascination with electric motors and the technology of real life railroads and encouraging a love of technology in kids. Similarly, chemistry sets, these were not new, but at mid-century, chemistry sets and toy microscopes were really popular, trying to spark, do I dare say it, spark, an interest in science in kids, usually boys. A lot of this was aimed at building a population of future scientists and engineers to keep up in the fight against the USSR. If you were really lucky, you could even get a set for a while that included some real radioactive ore. For obvious reasons, that was later eliminated due to safety concerns. Now, gender roles tended to be clearly separated in this era. Toys marketed to girls took a different approach. Toys for girls often encouraged domesticity. A lot of little girls received entire kitchen sets along with their shiny aluminum Christmas tree in this particular photograph, encouraging sort of homemaking or motherhood. This is a big era for baby dolls. If you look through mid-century catalogs, lots and lots of baby and toddler dolls. Or the Susie Homemaker line of home appliances. These debuted in 1966. These have reached icon status in the United States. Anyone here bake their very first cake in an Easy Bake Oven? The company Kenner introduced the first Easy Bake Oven in 1963. That year alone, more than 500,000 of them were sold. If you never had one, these were little toy ovens, and they would come with these little pans and little packets of cake mix, and they could bake actual tiny little cakes. They used the heat given off by a light bulb. All of these toys for girls are reflecting that American desire for nesting and cozy home life and being a good entertainer. I also think it is not a coincidence that Barbie debuted in this era. More kids this time posing with their Christmas tree. Barbie debuted in 1959. That was when she was introduced by the company Mattel at the New York Toy Fair. Barbara's creator, Ruth Handler, had seen her daughter Barbara playing with paper dolls. Now, one of the things about Barbie that was great for the companies is that Barbie played into the gender stereotype of women as good shoppers. Barbie came originally, if I go back, she was just wearing her zebra print swimsuit. And a lot of the fun of playing with her was buying Barbie's new clothes and appliances and furniture. Sales of Barbie went way up every year when the new outfits were introduced. Speaking of catalogs, this is a page from a Montgomery Ward's catalog. By the 1950s, the arrival of Christmas catalogs was a highly anticipated event. The Sears Christmas book usually came out in late August, and then it was, immediately squirreled away by kids who would spend weeks flipping through it, picking out what they wanted for Christmas. A lot of Americans got their first glimpses of every year's new Christmas decorations through these catalogs. This cover of the 1958 Sears Christmas catalog is showing a flocked Christmas tree. Those were those Christmas trees covered with sort of a white spray to make it look snow-covered and wire-wrapped ornaments. You could open up your Sears or Montgomery Ward catalog and learn about all kinds of new decorating trends like bubble lights. And do you remember those cardboard fireplaces if you didn't have a fireplace in your house? You could also learn what all the cool kids were wearing to Christmas parties that year. And of course, what all the new toys for that particular year were going to be. However, when we look at mid-century Christmas catalogs, in addition to all these new toys and clothes and decorations, there's also something interesting to note. There are a lot of craft kits, both for adults and for kids. Paint by numbers were really popular in the 1950s. You could also buy your kids an electric wood burning kit or a weaving loom. This is from the 1966 Montgomery Ward Christmas book. Remember those metal weaving looms where you could make pot holders? You could paint your own nativity scene or your own holiday Christmas ornaments. You could spray stencils onto your window with special stencil spray or even sort of soap if you like. What's going on? It seems kind of like an anomaly. This is an era of new technologies, right? You can buy things ready-made. What is going on with all of the crafts and do-it-yourself? Well, it's really not as surprising as it might seem. During World War II, a lot of Americans were encouraged and by the government, the Office of War Information, to do without, to buy war bonds instead of Christmas presents. And a lot of things were rationed or were really hard to find during the war. So handmade gifts were really popular during World War II. And prior to that, you had the Great Depression in the 1930s. A lot of people improvised or did without out of necessity. You could cut out silver stars out of aluminum pie trays, or you could string popcorn and decorate your tree with that, or use pine cones. All of these make-it-yourself traditions left a mark on that generation forever, which helps explain why, despite all of the post-war abundance, you still had do-it-yourself traditions well into the 50s and 60s. All that inventiveness gets carried over. So you see a lot of mainstream magazines encouraging housewives to do things like make personalized felt stockings for every member of your family. This is from the 1958 Family Circle magazine. Magazines like Woman's Day and Good Housekeeping and House Beautiful, they are just packed with these kinds of make-it-yourself, do-it-yourself instructions. You can make all kinds of things out of old coffee cans and felt and lace trim. You can make ornaments out of pipe cleaners, back when they were actually called pipe cleaners. Now they're what, chenille stems. Do you remember those cone-shaped water cups? Well, you can glue those together, cover them with paper or fabric, and make Christmas tree ornaments yourself. A lot of companies put out recipes for making homemade food gifts. These are cornflake candies. This is from a cookbook put out by, not surprisingly, the Kellogg's Company. What better way to sell more cornflakes, right? And a lot of these do-it-yourself, make-it-yourself craft ideas are tying together that impulse with new post-war materials like Styrofoam. This is a little booklet of 101 make your own styrofoam and trims decorations. And a lot of these tied together these materials. Here's a page from an Alcoa Aluminum Company booklet talking about how to make ornaments and wreaths for your front door. Crumple up aluminum foil and make a shiny silver wreath. And don't just make one, make 3. Why not? It's a good way for them to sell a lot of aluminum. You can use cellophane to cover up your homemade gifts, or buy more and make big poofs to put on your Christmas presents, or make an entire wreath out of cellophane. Why not? In other words, it all comes together at Christmas time. You've got the crafting tradition. You've got post-war materials like cellophane and aluminum. And you've got the Cold War encouraging Americans to nest like never before. Of course, you know, the impulse towards home and family was important in this era. And Christmas is the time of year when we tend to put family and home front and center. So let me finish up with one last beloved Christmas trend. In 1957, Theodore Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss, introduced Americans to the Grinch in his book, How the Grinch Stole Christmas. The Grinch is this hairy green character. He is like a Scrooge for mid-century. In the book, and then in the 1966 television cartoon based on it, the Grinch hates Christmas. He hates everything about it. So much, he decides he is going to steal it from the residents of Whoville. He takes all of their decorations, all their presents, all their food. But what happens? Well, the Whovilles still get together and celebrate. And the Grinch realizes Christmas doesn't come from material things, and then his heart grows 3 sizes and he joins their celebration. The first printing of How the Grinch Stole Christmas sold more than 50,000 copies. That set a new record for children's book sales. And interestingly, that same year, 1957, on December 10th, Macy's recorded the first $2 million day in department store history. And a lot of that was spent in the toy department where this new book happened to be available. But when we look at the story, what he was really talking about was the reminder that Christmas doesn't come from stuff. The Grinch is a direct commentary on that 1950s and 60s craze for over-the-top decorations, over-the-top presents, stuff, stuff, stuff. You know, the Grinch says, maybe Christmas doesn't come from a store. Maybe Christmas, he thought, means a little bit more. He's commenting on post-war America's craze for all of these commercial trappings of Christmas. And it's true, Americans had gone pretty crazy commercial in this era. And you could probably argue that has continued up to this day. People were reshaping Christmas to be this contemporary, affluent kind of celebration where you've got Bing Crosby on the new hi-fi set, right? And shiny brights and lead tinsel on the tree. Ironically, in the song White Christmas, Bing is nostalgic for Christmases like the ones I used to know. But what was happening in houses around the United States looked nothing like the Christmases that Americans used to know. Dr. Seuss wants to remind people Christmas is about family and good cheer, and it can arrive without all that exterior stuff. And isn't that exactly the same message as A Charlie Brown Christmas? Do you remember the end of A Charlie Brown Christmas when Charlie Brown asks if anyone knows what Christmas is really all about? And Linus says to him, "Sure, Charlie Brown, I can tell you what Christmas is all about." And without irony, he recites the text of the Annunciation to the Shepherds from the book of Luke. And at the end, he quotes the last line, which is, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace and goodwill toward men." Cold War Americans knew a lot about the wish for peace on earth. They had gone through 2 world wars, if you include World War I, and a worldwide economic depression. And now they were facing the threat of another and even scarier war with nuclear potential. And what was their response at Christmas time? It was to really cherish those close to home. I think that is a big part of the reason why we still love a lot about mid-century Christmas traditions. I mean, yes, it's true. If you grew up in this era, there's a lot of nostalgia. There's a lot of good memories of growing up with shiny, bright ornaments and, tinsel on the tree and lots of presents. You might remember hanging up dime store stockings on your cardboard fireplace. These boys have everything mid-century. They've got a plastic candle on the mantelpiece, and it looks like plastic poinsettias too. Yes, for sure, there's a lot of nostalgia, but I would argue there's more to it. I don't think it's just nostalgia. I think what we today often admire about the Christmas in this era is how well people knew how to nest and how to make the most of being at home with people that you love. All that focus on decorating and crafting and entertaining. What it's really about is bringing your family closer together. It is about optimism and cozy family life. And that is the part of mid-century Christmas that I think is really worth emulating today. So if you get tired of all of the Christmas ads that are popping up in your inbox, if your inbox online is like mine, or all of the online shopping, you can step back. You can get yourself an aluminum tree. The Vermont Country Store still has them. You can buy Shiny Brights. The Christopher Radko company now owns the brand name, and they still make vintage replicas. Or you can take a tip from the crafters at Mid-Century. You can go on Pinterest, and you can find a lot of do-it-yourself decorating instructions, and you can decorate it for yourself. Or better yet, sit down with your family and watch one of those great old mid-century TV Christmas specials. Because Charlie Brown would argue that really that is what Christmas is all about. So let me finish up by showing you my sources and to give you some recommendations. If you are interested in learning about this topic, my primary source for this particular talk was Sarah Archer's book, Mid-Century Christmas, which I highly recommend. But you can also find all kinds of memory books. The Sears catalogs from 1945 and 42 have been reprinted. You can go online and find Sears and Montgomery Ward catalogs online. The NORAD Santa website is noradsanta.org. You can also go to the Vermont Country Store, and they have tons and tons of fun mid-century Christmas food things and decorations and great memories. So you can take a screenshot of this screen if you would like to. But let me finish up with that. I'm going to close down my slide share. So you can take your last screenshot. And let's open it up for questions. If you've got questions, you can go into chat. You can type your question in there, and I am happy to answer them. And I've got a lot of great ones. Claudia mentioned she's got some gold trimmed angels. Claudia, I've got mine right here. It's one of my all-time favorites. For those of you, if you've never seen them, mine is actually a candle holder. So she's got a little present in the back. I absolutely adore those. So there you go. Oh, I'm glad it was a blast from the past. And for those of you interested, if you're interested in shiny bright ornaments are very collectible. They're really not that hard to find. You can go on eBay and you can go on Etsy. You can go to antique stores. There were a lot manufactured. The problem is that today they're really collectible. So be prepared to pay, or to, you can get some that are not in excellent shape. But a lot of these things are pretty easy to find because there's so much nostalgia for mid-century these days. So there you go. By the way, I have to tell you all a funny story. My father was a little too old. He wasn't a boomer. He was born in the late 30s. But when he was growing up, it was during World War II. And my grandparents had a glass ornament shaped like a pine cone. He thought it was a grenade. So he asked if he could be the one to put the Christmas grenade on the Christmas tree. And that began a tradition that in my family, we still have to this day. We hang the traditional Christmas grenade on the tree. I love Christmas memories like that one. There you go. I'm so glad it brought back some good memories. It really is an amazing era. Forgot, I also have here, I don't know if anyone remembers, there was a company called Lee Ward's, and Lee Ward's made all kinds of these little sequined ornaments. You could buy the kit and you would make it yourself. Lee Ward's sold a lot of beaded ornaments in this era, and they also are very collectible today. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions. So could it be possible we'll finish up right on time? How about that? Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you for coming to us. We appreciate it. Thank you,
That was
everyone, for
great.
signing up.
Thank you, Leslie.
I
Thanks,
know.
Marion.
And Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye.
Thank you.